Tonight, we're taking a trip back in time to the Edwardian era, just before the world erupted into modernity. Picture this: you're bundled up, hearing the distant clang of a horse-drawn carriage on cobblestones or the faint whistle of a steam train at the station. The air bites with a crisp chill that seeps into your bones, a cold that modern heating systems have made us forget. Your breath plumes in front of you, a fleeting cloud in the dim, gas-lit street. You can almost feel the dampness clinging to your wool coat, the scent of coal smoke hanging heavy in the air. You wouldn't survive a single Edwardian winter without a reality check on your reliance on central heating. So, before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's fun to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft hum in the background, and let's journey back in time together. As the leaves fell, painting the English countryside in shades of rust and gold, you'd feel a shift in the air. It wasn't just the temperature dropping, it was the palpable anticipation of winter. The chill wasn't just a seasonal change, it was a looming adversary that reshaped life. The romanticized image of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages hid the harsh truth of Edwardian winters. It wasn't about putting on a thicker jumper, it was about surviving. The cold didn't just nip at your nose, it threatened your very life, especially if you weren't wealthy. You'd wake up in a room that felt almost as cold as the outdoors. Your breath visible as mist in the bedroom air. Forget radiant floor heating or a thermostat. Your only defense was a coal fire in the grate, a luxury for the few. If you were fortunate, you might have a fireplace in your bedroom, but for most, one fire in the main living area was all you could expect. Imagine scrambling to get dressed under the covers before dashing to the warmth. Makes your morning commute in a heated car feel tropical, right? The Edwardians understood cold in a way we can't imagine. It wasn't just about feeling chilly, it was a constant threat of pneumonia, bronchitis, and the dampness that clung to everything. Some even slept with a heated brick wrapped in cloth at their feet, a primitive hot water bottle offering scant relief. Historians still debate whether the Edwardians' hardiness was a real physiological adaptation or a necessity born of constant discomfort. But one thing's clear: winter meant battening down the hatches, conserving resources, and preparing for months of a battle fought not with swords and shields, but with layers of wool, roaring fires, and quiet determination. So you've survived the shock of the morning air, and now you're pondering the monumental task of simply warming your dwelling. For most Edwardians, as we touched upon, this meant a fireplace, a gaping maw in the wall that greedily devoured coal, wood, or even peat if you were in the right part of the country. You'd quickly become intimately familiar with the rhythmic clang of the poker against the grate, coaxing stubborn lumps of coal into a vibrant heat-giving glow. But let's be honest, that roaring fire, while wonderfully atmospheric, was often more theatrical than practical when it came to truly warming an entire house. Think about it. Heat rises, right? So, most of the warmth from your grand fireplace would simply vanish up the chimney, carrying with it a significant chunk of your precious fuel budget. You'd find yourself constantly gravitating towards the hearth, your front toasty warm, your back a testament to the ambient chill of the room. It was a bit like trying to heat a ballroom with a single candle, charming in theory, utterly futile in practice. And for those who weren't fortunate enough to have a dedicated fireplace in every room, you'd rely on portable solutions. Enter the paraffin heater, a common sight in many Edwardian homes, especially those of the burgeoning middle class. Imagine a metal box with a wick, burning a petroleum-based fuel, giving off a rather distinctive, slightly oily smell. It offered a more localized heat, allowing you to warm a specific corner of a room, or perhaps a chilly bedroom for a short while before you dared to climb into bed. They were, however, notorious for their fire risk and the fumes they produced, often leading to headaches or worse if ventilation wasn't adequate. You'd learn to manage them carefully, a constant low-level anxiety in the back of your mind. It was a choice between being cold or risking an accidental blaze, a truly Edwardian dilemma. Beyond these common methods, some innovative, though rare, solutions emerged. For the truly wealthy, you might find the early iterations of central heating systems. These were often rudimentary affairs, involving hot water pipes snaking through walls or under floors, heated by a large boiler in the basement. A mainstream historical fact here: these early central heating systems were primarily found in grand public buildings or the mansions of the super-rich, a stark contrast to the individual hearths of the common person. They were a marvel of engineering at the time, but far from commonplace. A quirky tidbit that always makes me chuckle is the existence of the warming pan. Picture a long-handled pan, often made of brass, with a hinged lid. You'd fill it with hot coals from the fire, then slide it between the sheets of your bed to take the icy chill off before you dared to climb in. It's wonderfully inefficient, but speaks volumes about the sheer desperation to find any sliver of warmth. You'd probably find it utterly bizarre to think of shoveling hot coals into your bed, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on open fires, despite their inefficiency, perpetuated a certain architectural style that favored large rooms and high ceilings, making effective heating even more challenging. Regardless, your Edwardian home, even with its best efforts, remained a battleground against the persistent cold, a constant reminder that warmth was a commodity, not a given. With your home a perpetual battleground against the chill, your next line of defense was, of course, your clothing. Forget the lightweight, breathable fabrics we take for granted today. In Edwardian England, when winter truly bit, you dressed for survival, not for comfort or ease of movement. Think layers, and then more layers, until you felt less like a person and more like a walking, talking onion. For women, this often meant a bewildering array of undergarments: long-sleeved chemises, flannel petticoats, thick wool stockings, and possibly even combinations, a charmingly practical garment that united drawers and chemise into one. Over this formidable foundation, you'd then don a corset, a camisole, a blouse, and a heavy wool skirt. And that was just for indoors. Stepping outside required even more fortification. You'd pull on a substantial wool coat, perhaps lined with fur if you were well off, and accessorize with a heavy scarf, gloves, and a hat. The ideal Edwardian woman was, shall we say, well insulated. A mainstream historical fact you'd quickly learn to appreciate is the sheer volume of fabric involved. Wool was king, for its warmth and its ability to retain some heat, even when damp. Tweed, serge, and other dense weaves were commonplace. Imagine the weight, the bulk, the slight scratchiness against your skin. You'd move with a certain deliberate slowness, almost like a padded knight, a far cry from the sleek, athletic movements modern fashion affords. Forget trying to dash for a bus. You'd be waddling, hoping to generate some internal heat. For men, the story was similar. Long johns made of wool or flannel were essential, followed by vests, shirts, waistcoats, and heavy tweed or serge suits. Overcoats were an absolute necessity, often reaching below the knee, made of thick, dense wool. Hats, too, were more than a fashion statement. They were crucial for retaining body heat, whether it was a bowler, a fedora, or a flat cap for the working man. A quirky tidbit is the Edwardian obsession with body belts or abdominal belts, often made of flannel or wool, believed to ward off colds and kidney ailments by keeping the core warm. You'd probably find the idea of wrapping your midsection in a tight woolly bandage quite quaint, if not slightly stifling. Of course, social expectations played a significant role too. While warmth was paramount, you still had to maintain appearances. A lady of society wouldn't be seen in anything less than perfectly starched linens and meticulously arranged layers, no matter how much she longed for a lighter ensemble. This leads to a fascinating point. Historians still argue whether the elaborate layering of Edwardian fashion was purely a response to climate and lack of indoor heating, or if it also served as a subtle class marker, with the ability to afford numerous garments and the leisure to don them speaking volumes about one's social standing. Either way, you'd find yourself constantly adjusting, unbuttoning a bit indoors, buttoning up every single button when venturing out, a perpetual dance with the fluctuating temperatures and societal norms. Your closet would look less like a capsule wardrobe and more like a textile fort. Now that you're effectively a walking thermal blanket, let's talk about another crucial element of Edwardian winter survival: food. Your diet would shift considerably as the days grew shorter and colder, moving away from the fresh, seasonal produce of summer towards heartier, more caloric fare designed to fuel your internal furnace. Forget your light salads and delicate pastries. Winter was about stoking the fires within. A mainstream historical fact is that root vegetables and preserved foods formed the bedrock of the winter diet. Think potatoes, carrots, parsnips, and turnips, all of which could be stored for months in cool, dark cellars or clamps, surviving the frost and providing essential sustenance when fresh greens were but a distant memory. Cabbage, too, in its various forms, was a cold weather staple, often pickled or fermented to extend its shelf life. Meat, if you could afford it, would be salted, cured, or smoked to last through the leaner months. Imagine the endless cycle of preparing, storing, and then rehydrating these foods. It was a constant, practical undertaking. Your weekly shop would look less like a trip to a modern supermarket and more like a foraging expedition designed to build up your winter larder. Hot meals were not just about comfort, they were about necessity. Soups and stews, simmering for hours on the range, were absolute lifelines. These weren't your quick fix, 30-minute recipes. These were often one-pot wonders that could stretch a small amount of meat and a lot of vegetables into a filling, warming meal for an entire family. Think thick, bubbling broths laden with pulses like lentils and peas, or hearty beef and vegetable stews. A quirky tidbit: some Edwardian households would keep a communal stock pot on the back of the stove, constantly topping it up with scraps and bones, creating a perpetual soup base. It's certainly efficient, if a little, well, let's just say it required a strong constitution and perhaps a less sensitive nose than we might have today. You can almost smell that slow-cooked aroma mingling with the coal smoke, can't you? Baking also played a huge role, providing dense, energy-rich foods. Breads were heavier, often made with wholemeal flours, and puddings became richer and more substantial. Think suet puddings, rich with dried fruit and spices, or steamed treacle puddings, providing a much-needed burst of sugar and fat. These weren't just desserts, they were vital sources of calories to combat the pervasive cold. Historians still argue whether the robustness of the Edwardian winter diet, with its emphasis on fats and starches, contributed to the lower incidence of certain modern ailments, or if it merely highlighted the lack of variety and fresh produce available to the common person. Either way, you'd be constantly seeking warmth, and food was a primary, delicious weapon in that ongoing battle. Every meal was a strategic move, designed to keep the internal furnace roaring. Despite your valiant efforts with layers and hearty stews, the Edwardian winter was a formidable foe for your health. Forget the modern marvels of antibiotics and ubiquitous healthcare. For most people, illness in the colder months was a serious, often life-threatening, affair. You'd live with a constant, underlying apprehension, knowing that a simple cough could quickly escalate into something far more sinister. A mainstream historical fact that hits hard is the sheer prevalence and deadly nature of respiratory illnesses. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, often exacerbated by the damp, cold, and smoky conditions of many homes and workplaces, claimed countless lives. The chill didn't just feel uncomfortable, it actively weakened your immune system, making you more susceptible to whatever microscopic nasties were circulating. Imagine hearing the persistent, racking cough of a family member, knowing there was little effective medicine to truly combat it beyond rest, warmth, and perhaps some camphorated oil rubbed on the chest. Children were particularly vulnerable. Measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough, diseases that are now largely preventable or treatable, ripped through communities with devastating effect, especially in winter when people were crowded indoors. The high infant mortality rates of the era are a stark testament to the brutal realities of these illnesses. You'd likely witness firsthand the heartbreaking fragility of young life. Medical understanding was, by our standards, quite primitive. While germ theory was gaining traction, the practical application of hygiene and effective treatments was still in its infancy. Doctors, often referred to as apothecaries or surgeons, might prescribe poultices, tinctures, or tonics, many of which had questionable efficacy. A quirky tidbit: some Edwardian remedies for colds included things like a hot foot bath with mustard, or even a glass of hot beer with sugar and ginger. You might find yourself reaching for a concoction that sounds more like a strange cocktail than medicine, desperate for any relief. For the vast majority, access to formal medical care was limited and expensive. Most people relied on home remedies, the advice of older family members, or, in dire cases, the local workhouse infirmary, which was often a last resort. Historians still argue whether the stoicism often attributed to Edwardians in the face of illness was a cultural trait or simply a necessary coping mechanism in an age of limited medical options. Regardless, you'd learn to appreciate every day of good health, and the first signs of a sniffle would send a shiver down your spine far colder than the winter air itself. Staying healthy wasn't just about avoiding discomfort, it was about avoiding a potential death sentence. With the constant threat of illness looming and the daily struggle to stay warm, the Edwardian winter didn't pause for anyone's comfort, especially not when it came to work. For the vast majority, the demands of earning a living continued, often made infinitely harder by the biting cold, the pervasive damp, and the shorter, dimmer days. You'd quickly realize that your ability to earn a wage was directly tied to your physical endurance against the elements. Consider the factory worker, a mainstream historical fact you'd see everywhere. Imagine vast, unheated industrial spaces, often poorly lit, where men, women, and even children toiled amidst clanking machinery. The cold would stiffen fingers, making intricate tasks more difficult and increasing the risk of accidents. You'd feel the damp chill radiating from the concrete floors, seeping up through your worn boots, and the air would be thick with the smell of oil, metal, and the ever-present coal smoke. Breaks were brief, and the relief of a slightly warmer corner near a boiler was a luxury. Your productivity wasn't just about skill, it was about how long your body could resist the numbing effects of the cold. Outdoor professions, naturally, faced an even more brutal reality. The coal miner, descending into the earth, might find a paradoxical warmth deep underground, but the journey to and from the pithead was often through icy winds or treacherous snow. Agricultural laborers, a common sight in the countryside, would endure freezing rain and biting winds as they tended to livestock or performed whatever tasks could be managed in the frozen fields. Their hands would be chapped, their faces wind-burned, and their bodies perpetually chilled. A quirky tidbit is the use of fingerless gloves by many outdoor workers, particularly carters and deliverymen, allowing for dexterity while still offering some protection against the chill. You might wonder why they didn't just wear full gloves, but the need to handle ropes or packages meant constant exposure for their fingertips. Even for those in more genteel professions, like office clerks or shop assistants, the conditions were far from ideal. Offices might have a single fireplace, creating a hierarchy of warmth, where those closest to the hearth enjoyed a coveted, if partial, respite. Shops, while perhaps slightly warmer than the outdoors, still contended with drafts every time a customer opened the door. The concept of a comfortable, climate-controlled workspace was still decades away. Historians still argue whether the harsh working conditions of Edwardian winters, particularly the widespread illness and discomfort they caused, acted as a significant catalyst for early labor movements and demands for improved working environments. Regardless, for you, simply getting through a workday without succumbing to the cold or falling ill was a triumph in itself. The promise of your meager wages was often the only thing that kept you going, pushing through the shivering hours, knowing that warmth at home, however minimal, awaited. Transportation in the Edwardian winter was an adventure in itself, often fraught with delays, discomfort, and even danger. A simple trip across town could quickly become an epic journey when ice and snow descended. For most people, walking was the primary mode of transport. Imagine trudging along cobbled streets, slick with frost or buried under a fresh layer of snow. Your sturdy, sensible boots, though not fashionable, were your best friends, offering meager protection against the freezing ground. Your breath would fog in front of you, and the biting wind would whip around corners, finding every gap in your layers. You'd develop a keen eye for treacherous patches of black ice and learn the particular squelch of melting snow underfoot. Street cleaning was rudimentary, so snow and ice could persist for days or even weeks in less trafficked areas, turning daily commutes into obstacle courses. Public transport offered some respite, but it was far from the heated, efficient systems we know today. Horse-drawn omnibuses and trams, still common in cities, were drafty and cold, their interiors only marginally warmer than the outside. You'd huddle with other passengers, relying on communal body heat and the faint scent of horse mingled with damp wool. The horses themselves struggled on icy surfaces, making journeys slower and more prone to delays. The frustration of seeing your usual omnibus stuck, its horses straining, while you shivered on the pavement, was all too familiar. Trains, offering a faster way to travel long distances, were often unheated or minimally so. You might find a rudimentary foot warmer, a metal container filled with hot water or coals, placed under your seat, offering a small pool of warmth for your feet. Some railway companies employed foot warmer boys, whose job was to collect and replenish these warmers at various stops, a truly specialized winter occupation. The idea of someone literally bringing you hot rocks for your feet was both charming and utterly insufficient. For longer journeys, particularly by road, conditions could be perilous. Early automobiles, still a novelty for the wealthy, were open to the elements, demanding that drivers and passengers wrap themselves in multiple layers, including goggles and thick gloves, to brave the wind chill. Horse-drawn carriages, too, offered little protection, and the danger of skidding on ice or getting bogged down in snowdrifts was very real. Historians still argue whether the increased reliance on rail travel during winter months, compared to other forms of transport, helped solidify its economic dominance during this period. Regardless, every journey in the Edwardian winter was a testament to endurance, a reminder that the world didn't stop, even when everything seemed determined to freeze solid. Despite the formidable challenges of cold homes, demanding work, and treacherous travel, Edwardians found ways to maintain their social fabric, adapting their customs and gatherings to the harsh realities of winter. You might imagine everyone simply hibernating, but human connection remained essential, albeit in modified forms. Indoor social gatherings became the absolute norm, naturally. The grand balls and garden parties of summer gave way to more intimate, yet still elaborate, affairs held within the confines of private homes or public halls, where at least some effort could be made to keep warm. Afternoon tea, a quintessential Edwardian ritual, took on an even greater significance. Imagine settling into a drawing room, perhaps near that coveted fireplace, with steaming cups of tea and warm scones, the conversation flowing as the chill pressed against the window panes. A mainstream historical fact is that gaslighting, becoming increasingly common, helped extend the usable hours of the day for social interaction, turning dreary winter evenings into opportunities for connection. Evenings were often filled with music, parlor games, and reading aloud. Families would gather, perhaps around a piano, or play card games like whist and bridge. Lantern slides, the precursors to modern projectors, offered entertainment, displaying images of faraway lands or comical scenes. A quirky tidbit: some households would have musical evenings where family members and guests would perform songs or play instruments, a lovely way to pass the long, dark hours. You'd likely be expected to have a parlor trick or a song ready, whether you felt vocally inclined or not. It certainly beats endless scrolling through social media, doesn't it? For those with means, visits to the theater, opera, or concert halls were popular winter diversions. These grand establishments, while not always perfectly warm, offered a communal escape from the domestic cold, a chance to immerse oneself in culture and be seen. Public lectures and educational societies also saw increased attendance during winter, as people sought intellectual stimulation indoors. Historians still argue whether the increased emphasis on indoor domesticity during Edwardian winters strengthened family bonds and community ties, or if it simply highlighted the stark divide between those who could afford comfortable homes and entertainments and those who could not. Regardless, you'd participate in this collective effort to ward off the gloom, finding warmth not just from the coals in the grate, but from the camaraderie of shared experience. The Edwardian winter, in its own way, fostered a unique sense of togetherness, a quiet rebellion against the season's icy grip. While adults navigated the rigors of Edwardian winter with stoicism, children experienced the season through a unique lens, a mix of enduring hardship and finding joy in the simple, often fleeting, pleasures it offered. Their world, too, shrank to the confines of home and school, but with an added layer of youthful resilience. For many children, school remained a constant, regardless of the weather. Imagine a classroom, likely unheated or warmed by a single, struggling stove, where you'd huddle with your classmates, your fingers too numb to properly grip a pen. Ink would freeze in the inkwells, and the very act of sitting still for hours could be excruciatingly cold. The mainstream historical fact is that school attendance often dipped during the harshest winter months, particularly in rural areas, as children might be needed at home for chores, or simply couldn't brave the elements to get to school. For those who did attend, the focus was often on rote learning, with little in the way of engaging, hands-on activities that might have generated some warmth. At home, play was largely confined indoors. Picture children gathered around the fireplace, perhaps on a rug, playing board games like Ludo or Snakes and Ladders, or engaging in imaginative play with handmade toys. Reading aloud was a common family activity, providing escape into stories when the outside world was too forbidding. A quirky tidbit is the popularity of paper dolls and elaborate cutout scenes, offering hours of quiet, indoor entertainment that required little space and no expensive equipment. You might spend an entire afternoon meticulously cutting out tiny dresses for your paper figures, your concentration a shield against the chill. Outdoor play, when it happened, was often a cherished, exhilarating experience. A fresh snowfall would transform the drab winter landscape into a magical playground, albeit a cold one. Children would bundle up in every available layer, their rosy cheeks contrasting with the pristine white. Sledding, snowball fights, and even primitive ice skating on frozen ponds, often unsupervised and dangerous, it must be said, were opportunities for unbridled fun. You'd feel the rush of adrenaline as you flew down a snowy hill, the cold air stinging your face, a fleeting moment of pure freedom before the inevitable return to the chilly indoors. Historians still argue whether the challenges of Edwardian childhood, particularly the exposure to harsh winters and limited comforts, contributed to a greater sense of resilience and self-reliance in the adult population, or if it simply highlighted the inequalities of the era. Regardless, you'd learn early on the importance of making your own fun, of finding warmth in shared moments, and of appreciating the brief windows of exhilarating outdoor play before the frost sent you scrambling back inside, eager for a warm drink and a spot by the fire. The Edwardian winter, as you've come to understand, was a universal challenge, but its impact wasn't felt equally across the board. The stark divide between rural and urban survival became incredibly pronounced when the temperatures dropped, painting two very different pictures of how people coped. You'd quickly realize that while everyone shivered, some shivered with more options than others. In the urban centers, a mainstream historical fact is that sheer population density offered a peculiar kind of double-edged sword. On one hand, you had better access to coal and other fuels, often delivered by cart right to your door, though at a price. Shops and markets, even in the depths of winter, could offer a wider variety of preserved foods, and if you were desperate, there were soup kitchens and charitable organizations, however rudimentary, that might offer a warm meal or a blanket. The sheer number of people meant more public transport options, even if they were cold, and the proximity of neighbors might offer a shred of communal support. However, urban life also meant living in cramped, often damp tenements, where diseases spread like wildfire in the cold, unventilated conditions. The air was thick with soot and industrial pollution, exacerbating respiratory illnesses. Imagine the persistent coughs echoing through narrow alleyways, a constant soundtrack to the winter months. Conversely, in the rural areas, you faced a different set of challenges and advantages. Fuel might be more readily available if you lived near woodlands or peat bogs, potentially allowing for more consistent fires, though gathering it was often back-breaking work. Food, while less varied in terms of imported goods, could be more self-sufficient, relying on what was harvested and preserved from your own land or community. Farm work, however, was brutal in the cold, and isolation could be a serious issue. If you fell ill, medical help might be miles away, inaccessible due to snow-blocked roads. A quirky tidbit: in some remote rural communities, entire families would huddle together in a single room, often the kitchen with its constantly burning range, as a deliberate strategy to conserve body heat and fuel. It might not sound ideal, but it was effective, a collective defiance of the cold. Historians still argue whether the greater self-sufficiency of rural communities in winter, despite their isolation, made them fundamentally more resilient than their urban counterparts, who often relied on a precarious wage economy to afford even basic warmth. Regardless, you'd observe that the rhythm of life in the countryside slowed dramatically, dictated by the unforgiving elements, whereas the city, with its relentless industrial pulse, pushed on, demanding its inhabitants endure. Both faced the cold, but their battles were fought on very different terrains, with very different weapons and vulnerabilities. The Edwardian winter, as you've come to understand, was a universal challenge, but its impact wasn't felt equally across the board. The stark divide between rural and urban survival became incredibly pronounced when the temperatures dropped, painting two very different pictures of how people coped. You'd quickly realize that while everyone shivered, some shivered with more options than others. In the urban centers, a mainstream historical fact is that sheer population density offered a peculiar kind of double-edged sword. On one hand, you had better access to coal and other fuels, often delivered by cart right to your door, though at a price. Shops and markets, even in the depths of winter, could offer a wider variety of preserved foods, and if you were desperate, there were soup kitchens and charitable organizations, however rudimentary, that might offer a warm meal or a blanket. The sheer number of people meant more public transport options, even if they were cold, and the proximity of neighbors might offer a shred of communal support. However, urban life also meant living in cramped, often damp tenements, where diseases spread like wildfire in the cold, unventilated conditions. The air was thick with soot and industrial pollution, exacerbating respiratory illnesses. Imagine the persistent coughs echoing through narrow alleyways, a constant soundtrack to the winter months. Conversely, in the rural areas, you faced a different set of challenges and advantages. Fuel might be more readily available if you lived near woodlands or peat bogs, potentially allowing for more consistent fires, though gathering it was often backbreaking work. Food, while less varied in terms of imported goods, could be more self-sufficient, relying on what was harvested and preserved from your own land or community. Farm work, however, was brutal in the cold, and isolation could be a serious issue. If you fell ill, medical help might be miles away, inaccessible due to snow-blocked roads. A quirky tidbit: in some remote rural communities, entire families would huddle together in a single room, often the kitchen with its constantly burning range, as a deliberate strategy to conserve body heat and fuel. It might not sound ideal, but it was effective, a collective defiance of the cold. Historians still argue whether the greater self-sufficiency of rural communities in winter, despite their isolation, made them fundamentally more resilient than their urban counterparts, who often relied on a precarious wage economy to afford even basic warmth. Regardless, you'd observe that the rhythm of life in the countryside slowed dramatically, dictated by the unforgiving elements, whereas the city, with its relentless industrial pulse, pushed on, demanding its inhabitants endure. Both faced the cold, but their battles were fought on very different terrains, with very different weapons and vulnerabilities. While glimpses of technological progress offered a glimmer of hope for a significant portion of the Edwardian population, winter wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a period of desperate, relentless struggle. The plight of the poor during these brutal months was a grim testament to the era's deep social inequalities. You'd quickly discover that for some, survival was a daily, agonizing question mark. Imagine living in a single, unheated room in a crowded urban slum. This was the reality for countless families, where the walls might be damp, the windows ill-fitting, and the roof prone to leaks. There was no coal delivery here, no roaring fire in the grate. If you had any fuel at all, it might be scavenged scraps of wood or small quantities of low-grade coal, burned in a rusty bucket or a makeshift grate, offering negligible warmth and filling the air with acrid smoke. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this grim reality is the widespread problem of fuel poverty, where families simply couldn't afford enough coal or wood to stay warm, leading to chronic illness and even death from exposure. You'd feel the raw, pervasive cold deep in your bones, a constant companion that gnawed at your health and spirits. Food, which was already scarce, became even more so. With irregular work and meager wages, the ability to afford nourishing, warming meals diminished significantly. Children, especially, suffered from malnutrition, making them highly susceptible to the prevalent winter diseases we discussed earlier. Imagine the gnawing hunger, coupled with the shivering cold, a double assault on your resilience. For many, a warm meal from a soup kitchen or a charitable handout was a rare blessing, not a regular occurrence. The workhouse loomed as a terrifying last resort. This institution, a symbol of Victorian and Edwardian social welfare, offered shelter, food, and clothing in exchange for labor, but at a severe cost to dignity and freedom. Families were often separated, and conditions, while perhaps warmer than a slum dwelling, were harsh and punitive. A quirky tidbit is that workhouse inmates were often given thin, coarse blankets, and the sheer number of people in large dormitory-style rooms meant that even then, warmth was far from guaranteed. You'd likely hear hushed, fearful whispers about the workhouse, a place to be avoided at all costs, unless death was the only other alternative. Historians still argue whether the philanthropic efforts of the era, while well-intentioned, were ultimately insufficient to address the systemic poverty that made Edwardian winters so deadly for the working poor. Regardless, you'd witness the sheer, unvarnished hardship, the quiet desperation etched on faces, and understand that for too many, surviving the Edwardian winter was not a matter of comfort or convenience, but a brutal, relentless fight for their very lives against an unseen enemy, the cold itself. Despite the relentless chill and the stark realities of survival, Edwardians, like all people, sought out moments of joy, distraction, and entertainment to lift their spirits during the long, dark winter months. You'd find that finding diversions wasn't just about fun. It was a vital psychological antidote to the pervasive gloom. Public entertainment, when accessible and affordable, offered a much-needed escape. The music hall, a mainstream historical fact of the era, truly thrived in winter. Imagine stepping into a bustling, often smoky hall, filled with the cheerful cacophony of laughter, applause, and the clinking of glasses. Here, you could forget your shivering limbs for a few hours, engrossed by variety acts, singers, comedians, magicians, and dancers. The warmth of the crowd, combined with the often boisterous atmosphere, provided a tangible sense of relief from the biting cold outside. Even if the heating was rudimentary, the sheer energy of the place was infectious. Beyond the music hall, local pubs and alehouses served as crucial community hubs, offering a haven of warmth and camaraderie for working men. A pint of stout or a dram of whiskey, though costly, provided a temporary internal glow, and the roaring fire in the public bar was a magnet for anyone seeking respite from the elements. Card games, darts, and lively conversation filled these spaces. You'd learn to appreciate the simple pleasure of a shared laugh and a few moments of genuine warmth. For those with more leisure and means, indoor sports and hobbies gained prominence. Billiards and snooker rooms were popular, offering a genteel way to pass the time. Reading, always a favored pastime, became even more cherished, with libraries and reading rooms providing quiet, relatively warm spaces for contemplation and escape into stories. A quirky tidbit: some wealthier homes even had dedicated winter gardens or conservatories, often heated, where exotic plants thrived, offering a verdant, warm oasis in the midst of the frozen landscape. You might have seen these through a carriage window, a glimpse into a world of botanical luxury. Historians still argue whether the robustness of public entertainment during Edwardian winters reflected a deep-seated cultural need for escapism, or simply the entrepreneurial spirit of those who saw an opportunity to profit from people's desire. Regardless, you'd find yourself drawn to these pockets of warmth and light, seeking out any opportunity to forget the cold, even for a few precious hours, before returning to the undeniable reality of the Edwardian winter. These were the moments that provided mental fortitude, helping you endure until the first hopeful hints of spring. As autumn's vibrant hues faded and the air grew sharper, the Edwardian household embarked on a meticulous, almost ritualistic preparation for the coming winter. This wasn't just about stocking up, it was a deeply ingrained practice, a crucial period of fortification against the months of hardship ahead. You'd quickly learn that neglecting these preparations could mean the difference between a tolerable winter and one of genuine suffering. One of the most immediate and vital tasks was the stocking of coal and other fuels. For those who could afford it, tons of coal would be delivered and carefully stacked in the coal shed, a mainstream historical fact that speaks to the sheer volume of fuel required to maintain even a modest level of warmth. You'd hear the rhythmic thud of sacks being unloaded, the gritty dust settling on everything. For those less fortunate, every scrap of wood, every fallen branch, every lump of scavenged coal became a precious commodity, gathered and hoarded with meticulous care. The very act of collecting and storing fuel was a demanding physical endeavor, a race against the encroaching cold. Beyond fuel, the focus shifted to food preservation. The last of the summer and autumn harvest would be processed with earnest. Fruits were jammed, bottled, or dried. Vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and onions were stored in cool, dark cellars or in outdoor clamps, mounds of straw and earth designed to protect them from frost. Meats were salted, smoked, or cured, ready to provide sustenance when fresh supplies dwindled. Imagine the bustling kitchens, filled with the aroma of boiling sugar and spices, the clinking of jars, as families worked tirelessly to ensure their larders were full. A quirky tidbit is the use of pickling spice mixes, often family secrets passed down through generations, to preserve everything from cucumbers to eggs. You might find yourself assisting in the tedious, yet essential, peeling of countless apples for drying, your fingers sticky with juice. The house itself also required attention. Windows might be checked for drafts, and any cracks sealed with putty or strips of cloth. Heavier curtains were hung to provide an extra layer of insulation against the cold glass. Chimneys would be swept to ensure a clear draw and reduce the risk of fire. Every effort was made to make the dwelling as snug as possible, a small bastion against the encroaching chill. Historians still argue whether the comprehensive nature of Edwardian winter preparations fostered a strong sense of community and familial cooperation, or if it simply highlighted the profound anxieties people held about the coming cold. Regardless, you'd participate in this communal effort, a quiet understanding that survival depended on foresight and diligence. The turning leaves were not just a sign of autumn's beauty, they were a clear signal to prepare, to fortify, to brace for the long, hard battle ahead. So, you've dressed in layers, huddled by the fire, eaten your stews, navigated icy streets, and sought warmth in social gatherings. You've prepared your home and your larder. After months of this relentless battle, what does it truly mean to have survived the Edwardian winter? It means an understanding of resilience that perhaps few in our modern, heated world can truly grasp. It's about the quiet endurance of persistent discomfort. It's the memory of waking up to a room so cold your breath plumes, yet knowing you must rise and face the day. It's the constant, subtle chill that never quite leaves your bones, even when standing close to a fire. You wouldn't just feel the cold, you'd live it, breathe it, and fight it with every fiber of your being. This wasn't a fleeting discomfort that a flick of a thermostat could fix. It was a pervasive environmental force. A mainstream historical fact is that the average lifespan was considerably shorter, and harsh winters were undeniable contributors to this, especially for the most vulnerable. Survival was also about ingenuity and adaptation. It meant finding warmth in communal body heat, in shared blankets, in the steam from a hot tea, or even in the simple, repetitive movements of daily labor that generated a little warmth. It was about appreciating the small victories, a particularly hot ember, a well-placed foot warmer, a brief ray of sunshine breaking through the gray clouds. A quirky tidbit, sometimes seen in less affluent homes, was the practice of hanging wet laundry indoors, near the fire, not just to dry, but also to add a touch of humidity to the dry, cold air, creating a slightly less harsh breathing environment, even if it did make the house smell perpetually damp. It's about the profound shift in perspective. Our modern lives are often about chasing comfort and avoiding hardship. For Edwardians, particularly those not in the privileged classes, hardship was simply the default, and comfort a fleeting luxury. This constant struggle, however, forged a remarkable stoicism. Historians still argue whether this societal stoicism was a strength that enabled survival, or if it masked a deeper suffering that was rarely voiced. Perhaps it was both. Ultimately, having traversed this Edwardian winter, you carry with you a silent appreciation for warmth, for good health, and for the sheer ingenuity of people facing overwhelming odds. It was a time when the turning of the seasons held a profound existential significance. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't just a change in weather, it was a deeply felt, communal sigh of relief, a triumph, a renewal of life itself after a long, hard-won battle. The Edwardian winter wasn't merely a period on the calendar, it was a crucible that tested patience, health, and spirit, leaving an indelible mark on all who endured it. As the imagery of coal dust and damp wool begins to fade, let your own mind drift away from the chill of Edwardian England. Feel the warmth of your own bed, the gentle hum of your fan, or the quiet stillness of your room. The struggles of the past are now just echoes, gentle whispers in the quiet of the night. There's no need for thick layers or a search for fuel now. Just the comforting weight of your blanket and the slow, steady rhythm of your breath. Let any lingering thoughts of the cold dissolve, replaced by a sense of deep, peaceful rest. The history is done for tonight, and all that's left is for you to simply let go.